Little Nightmares 3 is releasing sometime this year, supposedly, and I bet it will bring a wave of new fans to the series. But the older games contain a bunch of mysteries, secrets, and hidden details. So whether you are brand new to the series or just fancy a refresher, here are 10 things you might have missed in Little Nightmares. Wait, what do you mean I already did this video? Yeah, well that video is old and trash, a bit like me. Here are 10 things you might have missed in Little Nightmares Remastered. Number 1. Symbolism of the Maw. Little Nightmares takes place on a giant submersible structure known as the Maw. This leviathan rises from the sea once a year, always at the same time, but never in the same place. Once it surfaces, these giant people known only as the guests arrive by boat. They board through this giant door, and they are never seen again. Now, while this mysterious place contains many secrets, quite a few of which I'll be discussing today, its design gives us hints to the core themes of the game. Little Nightmares was originally going to be called Hunger. Almost everything in the game is a reference to hunger and consumption in some way or another. Those guests board the Maw to eat as much food as they can. The children held in the lower parts of the Maw are only given scraps. Both of these groups are hungry, but in very different ways. Then of course there are the more complex types of hunger that we see with the lady, and of course the playable character 6. More on those later. But the design of the Maw fits in perfectly with this theme. The Maw itself is hungry. Now you might have noticed that the giant doorway that the guests enter the Maw through looks like a giant mouth. In fact, it looks eerily similar to both the fireplace in the kitchen and even one of the twin chefs. But that is by design. Maw is another word for mouth, and just like everything else in the game, the Maw swallows what it can. The only difference here is that the guests are eaten by the Maw voluntarily. But the symbolism goes far deeper than that. As we will discuss shortly, none who enter the Maw ever leave. They are metaphorically eaten by it, but the entire Maw behaves as if it were alive. Not only does it swallow its prey, but it even has a way to digest them. The leeches we find scattered around the deeper areas act as the Maw's stomach acid, breaking down anything that the mouth didn't. Of course, this is only a metaphor, but the similarity to a living being is clear. Once it's had its fill, the Maw descends back into the sea, a year-long nap until the next feeding time. But if you thought that the guests being metaphorically eaten by a giant sea monster was creepy, wait until you find out what really happens to them. Number 2. The guests are cooked. Literally. Now as I said, the guests who enter the Maw are never seen again, but all throughout the game we are given subtle, and some not so subtle, clues as to what happens to them. On the surface, the Maw seems like a vacation retreat, an all-you-can-eat buffet cruise. This is likely what draws the guests to the Maw in the first place. They obviously can't get enough food, and this probably seems like heaven to them. But while this stuff isn't exactly prepared by Gordon Ramsay, the guests should probably take a closer look at the menu. The reason why none of the guests ever leave is because they are eaten by the next load of guests that arrive. The key piece of evidence for this is in the bathhouse type areas we visit towards the end of the game. Now these might look like a place for the guests to relax in between courses, but the reality is far darker than that. In one of these rooms we can find a guest who has fallen asleep with his hand in a bucket of water. But if you thought this was just a harmless prank by this gnome, then you are sorely mistaken. Right above this room we can see another one of the same size, but inside this one we can see the silhouette of one of the chefs chopping someone up. This bucket of water was actually there to make sure the guest wasn't going to wake up when the chef starts his work. Now this perfectly explains why the guests who enter the Maw are never seen again. Them being swallowed by it was actually much more literal than you thought, but it also means that these guests that we see are actually eating other humans. Now if you paid attention throughout the game, there were a ton of hints that this was happening. We can see Roger the janitor wrapping up children and sending them off to the kitchens, and we can even see this room that shows a guillotine and a bathtub. I think this shows that not only has this been going on for a long time, but also the staff in the Maw have refined the process so they can serve more and more guests. But in a twisted sort of way, this horrific process actually makes sense. We see that the Maw does have food stores, particularly a lot of fish. The concept art shows that the Maw has fishing nets that it drags along behind it. And we do see that the Maw also has some stores of fruits, vegetables, and meat. But these guests are so large and their appetites so ravenous that I'm willing to bet that this lot would go through the Maw's food stores pretty quickly. In fact, This is probably why they come here in the first place. Nowhere else can serve them enough food to truly sate their hunger. But with new boats on the way, the Moor needs to restock. And luckily for them, they have plenty of meat on hand. This further ties into the Moor symbolism. Just like a fisherman or a trapper using bait to lure an animal into a trap, the Moor uses food to bait its prey too. Those guests are the prey, and they are fattened up like pigs to be slaughtered later. This is probably where the pig that we see in every Little Nightmares game comes from. The pig we see in Little Nightmares was actually cut content. It was something the developers seemed to try and get into every game, but for one reason or another it never made it in. Now that's interesting, since the developers' next game, Reanimal, does indeed feature a giant pig. It seems like Tarsier finally got to create the monster they wanted. But that pig is also a reference to something else, which leads me very nicely into my next point. Number 3. The inspirations of Little Nightmares. If you thought giant anthropomorphic pigs were familiar, then you're probably a Studio Ghibli fan. If you've seen Spirited Away, you'll probably remember that the main character, Chihiro, usually called Sen, begins her journey into another world when her parents are turned into pigs for helping themselves to a buffet. This is probably the inspiration behind the pig that was cut from Little Nightmares and eventually found its way into Reanimal. But Sen's name is also very similar to 6. Not only are they both 3-letter words beginning with S, but Sen translates to 1000. Both have numbers for a name. But that isn't the only reference to Spirited Away in Little Nightmares. The guest areas of the Moor are heavily inspired by the bathhouse in the movie, and many of the Moor's aesthetics are inspired by similar scenes. The leeches in Little Nightmares look like they are made from the same substance as No-Face, and this theme has been carried over to Reanimal too. This creature looks like a cross between No-Face and the Suck creatures that show up in several Ghibli movies. Some of the enemies across the Little Nightmares series seem to have been inspired by characters in Ghibli movies, and even the Moor itself does share some similarities with Howl's Moving Castle. But these similarities even seem to be carried over to the upcoming Little Nightmares 3. The giant baby enemy we can see in the trailers was actually based on concept art from Little Nightmares 2, but that itself is likely a reference to Bo, the giant baby from Spirited Away. We can see several references to Spirited Away in this concept art, and we can even see the eye symbol that is everywhere in the Little Nightmares series too. But Little Nightmares didn't just take inspiration from Studio Ghibli. It took a lot of inspiration from children's stories and folklore. The gnomes in Little Nightmares are spelt without the G, and they could be a reference to the Oz series, which also featured a race called gnomes. Gnomes generally are found in many different folklores. The lady, the main antagonist of the first game, also has some very dark inspirations. She's likely inspired by the yokai of Japanese folklore. The lady has obvious Japanese inspirations, from her dress that resembles a kimono, to her black hair, and her white mask that resembles the painted white faces of geisha. But her behavior is eerily similar to several yokai, incredibly scary supernatural creatures from Japanese mythology. Many yokai feed on humans, some even feeding on children. They often do this by tricking wary travelers or other such vulnerable people. This is very similar to what we see hinted towards in Little Nightmares, the guests themselves being tricked into boarding the Moor. But more specifically, the lady shares similarities with yokai such as the Aoniobo, a spirit who resembles a noble, often seen waiting in abandoned homes, fixing her hair and her looks while she waits for a guest to arrive. These spirits were once ladies of the court in Japan. They were known for being well educated, sophisticated, and beautiful. Like many women of the era, their ultimate goal was to find a husband, preferably someone wealthy and with a good name. But no matter how hard they tried, some could never attract the right man. The legend goes that some of these unsuccessful women would grow bitter as they grew older. Their failure over time slowly turned into hatred, and when they died, they turned into yokai. The Aoniobo waits patiently for their husband who will never come, and any unfortunate guest who visits the home of this yokai is eaten whole. The lady going back to fixing her looks and awaiting once more. The lady shares several similarities to this yokai. The Aoniobo wears a kimono and has a face painted white, similar to the lady's design. We can see the lady looking into a mirror and sobbing in the DLC, a grotesque and monstrous face looking back. This is something that I have theorized is due to the lady mourning the loss of her looks. This vanity probably being the reason why the lady sought out dark magic in the first place, a way to reverse the natural order of time and restore her youth. Her looks are something that she clearly values. She spends a long time fixing her hair, and you can see a lot of the portraits around the moor show her as young and beautiful. Just like the yokai, the lady also waits for guests, who are also feasted on while she goes back to fixing her looks for the next guests to arrive. But that isn't the only similarity to yokai in Little Nightmares. The Itsuki, which translates to strangling ghosts, sometimes known as hanging ghost, are spirits of those that passed away after, well, I can't say this on YouTube, but you can probably guess. These lingering spirits try to convince others to do the same, and we see several hints to things like this throughout the games. But even more mysteriously, the Ongaikyo, which translates to mirror beyond the clouds, is known as a haunted mirror. The mirror is haunted by one or more spirits, and they can manipulate the reflection to anything they like. Often they will show a twisted reflection of someone who looks into it, showing them a hideous, monstrous form of themselves. Now, not only does Little Nightmares 1 feature a heavy theme of mirrors, the lady even looking into one and seeing a horrific version of herself, but the upcoming Little Nightmares 3 has hinted that mirrors are going to be important once again. But to bring all this full circle, the witch in charge of the bathhouse in Spirited Away is named Yubaba. Now, not only does she order her employees to slaughter Sen's parents who are now pigs, which would be a form of cannibalism, but her name resembles two other figures from folklore. Yubaba shares a similarity with Baba Yaga, a crone from Slavic folklore who is sometimes depicted as a witch who eats young children. But this name also shares a similarity with the Japanese mountain witches Yama-uba. These hags are often described as tricksters too. They find travelers who have grown wary from crossing mountains and they offer them food and shelter. Once they fall asleep, the Yama-uba transforms into her true form before devouring the travelers as they slumber, sometimes even using dark magic to do so. This theme of monsters, spirits, or witches eating people is something very common across many cultures. Hansel and Gretel is one of many such examples. In that story, a witch lures children to her hut using candy or sweets, with the intentions of, you guessed it, eating them. It seems like Little Nightmares takes inspiration from many of these tales to create a truly terrifying world for us to explore. And I definitely think that the Japanese themes here gives us hints that they took inspiration from yokai. Number 4. The Secret Lady Shrine. Right before you enter the kitchens, there is a room that is hard to find unless you already know that it's there. After dropping down this chute, you can find a room that looks just like a small shrine to the lady. It contains several portraits, several of the mysterious jars shaped like the lady that contain dark essence, and finally, a letter. Now the pictures here mostly show the lady in one form or another, except this one that shows a different woman in red. The most bizarre part of this portrait is that she's facing away from us. Perhaps yet another clue to the lady's vanity, and perhaps even jealousy. But the letter is also interesting considering that we see the hanging man towards the start of the game has a letter like this at his feet. Now I've already made a whole theory on this, I will leave it linked in the description for after, but this room definitely seems significant, especially since we see something very similar in the Pale City in Little Nightmares 2. It does seem like someone idolizes the lady. I wonder if they know what she really gets up to. Number 6. Shadow 6. When you begin Little Nightmares, you assume that the child you play as is trapped here. The world around you is monstrous, but you seem just like a child trying to survive. But as the game progresses, you slowly learn that there is more to 6 than meets the eye. This child has a dark secret. Our first clues to this are when we learn that 6 has a mysterious hunger. Just after meeting Roger for the first time, while walking past this boy, 6 suddenly begins to double over in pain as her stomach begins to rumble. This not only comes on incredibly quickly, but it's also accompanied by a very sinister sounding music. This hunger only grows over time. First, 6 eats this bread and she seems to be okay, but she needs more and more as the game goes on. Slowly, she moves on to meat, then a live rat caught in a trap, before ultimately choosing to kill and eat the gnome, who, just like the boy at the beginning, tries to help her. That moment might have been heartbreaking for you. The gnomes we see throughout the game seem to be helpful little critters who wish no harm on anyone. so to see Six kill one like this was quite a kick in the feels. But if you've played the DLC, you will know that this moment is actually far more tragic. I'll probably cover that in another video before Little Nightmares 3 comes out. There's a lot of secrets in the DLC, so don't worry if you haven't played it yet. The final act of Six's hunger is after we have defeated the lady in the final showdown. After using the mirror against her, the lady is left defenseless. Despite no longer being a threat, Six tears into the lady's neck, killing her for good. Not only that, but it seems like Six takes her dark powers for herself, now able to kill the guests with ease. Well, I say kill, but if you look very closely, the guests are still twitching after this, so like most things in Little Nightmares, kill is debatable. Now this progression of hunger is incredibly dark and mysterious. Why does Six have this hunger? Why does she kill the gnome instead of eating the sausage, and so on? But there is a hidden detail here that makes this mystery even more suspicious. Every time Six eats, hidden somewhere in the background is a shadow version of herself. It silently watches as Six feeds. Now this figure is shown in the secret ending of Little Nightmares 2, and it's strongly suggested that it is the one that convinces Six to travel to the moor in the first place. Now, as with most things in Little Nightmares, there isn't a definitive answer as to who this shadowy figure is. It could be a manifestation of Six's darker side, her more predatory nature brought to life. Or it could be some other dark force, another entity that is just using Six's form to control and manipulate her. Whatever it is, on my latest playthrough I noticed that this shadow only appears when Six is hungry, and her hunger only seems to appear when she's around somebody helpless and suffering. The boy in the kitchen seems to have been left there alone to rot, while all the other children are in bed. The meat in the cage is surrounded by rats strung up by their tails. The rat that Six eats is trapped by its neck in a rat trap, and the gnome Six eats has just lost everything they worked so hard for since they were human just moments earlier. The lady herself was full of suffering before her final moments too. She might be a monster, but that doesn't mean that she isn't suffering in her own way. When Six approaches her, you can see that she even moves in a way that almost looks like she's letting Six finish what she started. Either way, Shadow Six is a mystery we'll probably never get answers to. But just like my next point, she serves as foreshadowing as to how dark the game really is. Number 7. So much foreshadowing. Little Nightmares is absolutely full of horror, mystery, symbolism, and also foreshadowing. In fact, sometimes it goes beyond foreshadowing and into full-on spoiler territory. I talked earlier that the guillotine next to a bathtub was hinting at the big secret we would learn in the bathhouse areas. The rats being lured into a trap with food was also foreshadowing to the same thing. Those guests were lured into the moor with food in the same way. This moment of Six being trapped like this was both a foreshadow but also a trick. The game seems to be drawing a parallel of Six being trapped like a rat, but we later learn that Six is actually the predator, not the prey. Six eating the rat in the trap was also foreshadowing to how she would eat the gnome later. There is a TV that is hidden behind a fairly easy puzzle, but one that is easy for most people to miss. This giant eye-shaped screen shows off several of the areas and enemies that you will face later in the game, but if you press it one final time after it closes, it shows off the mirror that Six will use to beat the lady. Talk about spoilers! But we can also find this picture in a room right near the start of the game that completely spoils the ending. We can see that someone drew Six in her yellow raincoat surrounded by darkness, which is exactly how this game ends. Of course, as I already stated, Six has her own foreshadowing, Shadow Six being a literal foreshadow to her darker side, but the gnomes foreshadow this too. They always run from Six until she hugs them. Those gnomes definitely sense danger when it comes to Six. But to be fair, they seem to run away from most things, so this was a bit harder to spot. The guests even foreshadow their own fate too. As they board the moor, we can hear what sounds like a song or humming. It appears to say, "Chop me up, enjoy," foreshadowing what eventually happens to them. Roger sending children to the kitchens wrapped up was a massive foreshadow to the guests eating people, and the room full of thousands of shoes is both a hint to that, and it also shows us just how long this has been going on for, all these shoes belonging to the thousands of victims that the moor has claimed. There are absolutely loads more examples of foreshadowing like this, We even see portraits of some of the enemies we will face in later parts of the games, or even in future games. It seems like Tarsier aren't only the kings of creepy, but they're also the kings of foreshadowing. I wonder if the Reanimal trailer has any similar foreshadowings. I guess we'll have to wait and see. Number 8. The staff are wearing masks. One of the creepiest details in Little Nightmares is the fact that many of the enemies seem to be hiding their real faces. Of course, the lady hides her face behind a white mask, but so do Roger the janitor and the twin chefs. We can clearly see with Roger that his skin is falling down around his head. Some people have speculated that this is why he is blind. Now, I don't personally think this is true. I mean, he could easily pull that skin away from his eyes with those lanky arms, but we do see in Little Nightmares 2 that there is a mask that matches his face perfectly on the wall in the hospital. Perhaps the reason why Roger's face is so messed up is because we killed his doctor. We'll get to that in the Little Nightmares 2 recap. But several times throughout the kitchen areas, you can see that the chefs are hiding their face as well. This one even lifts his mask briefly to scratch his face. Now, once again, there is no definitive explanation for this, but my own personal interpretation is that this is just further evidence of the trick that these staff are pulling off. They wear masks to make themselves look more friendly and inviting to the guests. After all, it's these chefs that serve the food, and it's these guests that end up being chopped up by these same people. It's all part of the trick and part of the trap. These chefs want to appear friendly, but we know that it's all just a facade. But this could also be yet one more symptom of the lady's insecurities. We can see that she wears a mask, possibly to hide her face that she considers ugly, and perhaps she forces everyone around her to wear a mask so that she doesn't look so out of place. Or maybe she was even the one that ruined their faces in the first place. Either way, I think that all the staff here are wearing masks is just one further hint to the fact that the Moor is not what it seems. Very similar to 6, and a huge hint towards Mono in Little Nightmares 2. Number 9. There's never anything good on the TV. One of my favourite moments from the first Little Nightmares game is the time where we use a television to distract Roger. Just one further crime we can add to 6's list: daylight robbery. But the television we use is not only incredibly disturbing, but it also hides some secrets. The first channel you encounter, and likely the only one most players will see, shows an incredibly strange song alongside arguably the creepiest part of the entire game. Now, this is creepy to me because it shows a real person inside of an animated game world. I don't know about you, but this always unsettles me in a good way. It's like reverse Uncanny Valley. I love when games do this well. But the creepy show is accompanied by this song that is weird yet oddly catchy. Now, some tried to figure out what the lyrics to this song were, but it turns out it's just adapted from an old children's song in the UK.
Ice cakes, spice cakes, all 40, and we'll have a wedding at 3:30. Pom, pom, here comes a taxi cab, pom, pom, here comes a taxi cab, pom, pom, here comes a taxi cab, ready for the wedding at 3:30.
This song returns in Little Nightmares 2 with the children in the school singing it as well. But if you press the button on the TV again, you can find that there are several more channels. Most show symbols of the eye made to look like the Illuminati, the Illuminati if you will, but the final one shows a very creepy shadowy figure lurking over the bed of a child. This one is most likely supposed to be a creepier version of children's bedtime stories, but it is interesting how relevant this theme is to the first game. This shadowy figure has a long hooked nose, something typically associated with witches. With what we now know of the lady and her ties to witches and yokai, well, the connection becomes clear. Number 10. The ending isn't what you think. One of the oldest theories for Little Nightmares is one of the theories that I disagree with the most. There has been this constant idea that 6 becomes the next lady at the end of the game. The main reason some people think this is because 6 seems to take the lady's power. She now would have the ability to take over the Moor. There is evidence that the Moor used to contain more than one lady, and some people think that this is evidence that the Moor is operating on some sort of cycle. with 6 now taking over the role until someone takes it from her. This theory only got worse with the release of Little Nightmares 2 that strongly suggested that Mono is trapped in a time loop, growing up to become the Thin Man, only to be killed by his younger self, who then repeats the cycle. Now, not only do I think this theory isn't true, but the game gives us a massive clue right at the end that 6 intends to leave the Maw behind. Right at the end of the game, we see 6 supposedly kill these guests before heading up this staircase which leads to the outside. Now, not only is that clue number 1 that 6 doesn't intend to stay here, but if you keep the game running after the credits, something I bet a lot of players don't do, you can see 6 waiting on the outside of the Maw. Once you press back, we hear a foghorn signaling that the next ship is about to arrive. Now, to me, this heavily implies that 6 intends to board the ship and leave. After all, who's going to stop her now? But if she intended to stay on the Maw, why would she be out here like this? If she intended to keep the cycle going, wouldn't she be inside preparing for their arrival? Not only that, but I think the personality of 6 is far different to that of the lady, and I think her staying here completely undermines her entire journey across these 3 games. 6 has done everything to stop herself being trapped, and staying on the Maw would spit in the face of that. No, I think 6 left here once the game ended, and I really do hope we get to see her in some way or another in a future game. So those are 10 things you might have missed in Little Nightmares. There are more. Roger's arms move after they are chopped off. You can see in the freezer a rat, a gnome and a dead body wrapped up, showing how everything here is considered meat, and the sack of toys in one of Roger's rooms is moving, implying that he uses children to make these toys. Creepy. If you did enjoy the vid, don't forget to leave it a like, and now might be a good time to subscribe since Little Nightmares 3 is on the way, and I will have plenty more videos for you before then. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you on the next Tericho Theory.